Hello everyone. Welcome to another tutorial of REST API series. My name is Jairaj and thanks for joining again. So in previous tutorial we have discussed headers and its properties. Also we have seen few important ones in details and guidelines for using them. So moving ahead in our series, in this video we will discuss about response codes. But before starting this video, hit that red subscribe button to support this channel so we can keep providing you good quality content. Also, don't forget to like and share because our goal here is to provide knowledge to as many people as possible. So let's start with this video. So we know about various segments of REST communication such as URI, HTTP methods, HTTP headers, response and request body. And also we have response code or status code. So to make our communication successful at both client level as well as server side, response code is an important part. And this code is a number associated with a response from server, and this number are very important because it is the shortest description of what happened at the server side with that request. So client can know so many things about what happened to request at server side, like request successfully finished or not, or rejected by server, or it is waiting for something. So without this number, client is kind of blind, meaning this response code provides acknowledgement to client, and so with this code client at least know what is happening. And this number looks something like this, where we have 500 which is a number and shortest description which is representing internet server error, or we have 200 OK. So there are 5 groups of this response code based on type of the response, and these groups are information response, which start with 1. We have second group which is for successful response, which is start with 2, and we have redirectional response codes starts with 3, and client error starts with 4, and server error starts with 5. So let's discuss them one by one. So first we have information response code, and these codes are for information purpose, and also it is an interim response, and the meaning of that is it comes from server before finishing the entire request. So it is an intermediate response coming from server to give some information about request which is not finished yet, and after this code there will be one more final response coming from server. So first we have 100 continue. So this response code shows that everything is okay so far. So basically clients needs to enable this by putting expect 100 continue in initial request. After that, when client sends a request, server will validate all the prerequisite to handle that request, and if everything is good, then server will tell client to continue this request by sending 100. Otherwise it will send 417 expectation failed response. So let's understand them by example. So here I am using a practice project of a Spring Boot, and where we have few APIs such as post, put, get and delete, and I have one book collection in my MongoDB. And now I can't test this use case in Postman, so I'm gonna use curls command here. And first let me start my Spring Boot application and open terminal. And in this terminal I need to type curl for curl command, then exchange for x, and I'm using post method, so post, and we have header. So inside header we have expect 100 continue, and also here I need to pass another header which is showing content type equal to application JSON. And then we have -d which is for data, and I need to put this objects. So basically we are trying to post, we are trying to create one book inside this collection and using this data. And after this I need to pass URL which is localhost :8080 and books. And at the very last I need to pass -v. So this -v is for details. So in the response this terminal will print everything in detail. And now if I hit this command, I can see it is showing some details. So first we have connected to localhost with port 8080. That means HTTP connection with server has been established. Then we have details about our request, where we have host details and we pass expect with 100 continue, and content type is application JSON. So after that, if you see, we have less than sign and HTTP 1.1 100. So this less than sign means it is coming from server, and then we have completely uploaded a sentence. So that means is after 100 our client again upload the request body, and then 200 response came. So what happened here is first a connection has been established between client and server, and after that client sends a header only. So server can validate details such as content length, content type, and if server is able to handle that request, then server will give acknowledgement to client by sending 100 continue code and tell client that it can handle this request, and client can send the rest of the details, which is request body. So after this 100 response, client sends or upload request body, and that's why we are seeing this, we are completely uploaded and fine line. And after processing this successfully, server gives final response. So this way this entire communication happen in two steps, where in first step server validate all the details inside header and then request body. So benefit of using this code is to save network bandwidth, and if request is too big, and the server can decide by just getting header from client and decide whether they needs to process this request or not. So moving ahead, next three response codes, I don't think you guys gonna ever use that, but for information purpose let's discuss them. So we have 101 switching protocols. So this 101 switching protocol, it is to notify client that server is switching protocol. So in a header, client can pass upgrade property to ask for specific protocol, and if server agrees to switch, then it sends 101. So now we know that we have HTTP protocol, which is hypertext transfer protocol, and which is for REST purpose. But now our question is, what is this protocol switching and why we need them? Also, what is this WebSocket here in the example? So here one thing to note is that our modern web is evolving too fast, and we have application that can consume so much data. So for example, browser based games. And if you ever played this browser based games, then you know that this application to run properly, it requires sending data back and forth very fast. But our traditional HTTP requires header and cookies and a lot of other stuff. And this other stuff which can create huge latency at the client side. And when we are calling multiple APIs at a time and transferring a lot of data at a time, this is not good idea. And additionally, in this kind of scenarios, details coming in headers and cookies, client normally doesn't use it. And also client needs to send a request every time to get fresh data. So here we can make this communication faster in two steps. First step is if client doesn't need to send these extra details every time in headers and cookies. And second step is instead of client fetching data from server, if server can push this data to client, then we can make this communication a little bit faster. So to solve this issue, we have WebSocket protocol, which is different than our traditional HTTP. And this WebSocket protocol keeps the connection open and keeps sending data back and forth without any overhead of header and cookies. Also, this is a full two-way communication, or we can say bidirectional communication. That means that server also can push data without client asking it. So this way, this protocol can solve all of our problems. So this kind of application are there on the internet and we are using it every day. So for example, we log into our account on gaming side using this HTTP, but when user start game, it gets switched to WebSocket protocol. So in this case, we need to use this response code. It is again a huge topic of discussion, but for now this information is enough. Moving ahead, next we have 102 processing, and this response code represents that a server received request and it is processing the request, but right now there is no any response to send, or there is nothing to show to client. So most probably this happens when server is going to take more than 20 seconds to process a request, and normally server keeps giving this acknowledgement to client to prevent timeout error. So normally at the client side we have timeout error after 20 or 30 seconds, automatically client reject that request if server won't respond. But if this process is gonna take too long, then server acknowledge that nothing is wrong at the server side, but it can take the time. So next we have 103 early hints, and as name suggests, meaning of this response code is to give some hints to the client. And that meaning is server is telling client that server is preparing your response, and meanwhile client can start other processing of preloading of data. And usually we use this code with link property in the header, where we provide additional links related to this resource, and the client can get other information from links meanwhile server is preparing the data. So this is the approach of making communication little bit faster. So moving ahead, next we have a success related response code, and we get one of these codes when request successfully executed at the client side. And in this, first we have is 200 OK. So this means request has succeeded and there is something in the request body. So for example, if we fire get or head APIs, then we have received data, or in case of put and post, server have finished processing and client receives some response. So you will see this response code almost everywhere because this is very basic success response code. So moving ahead, next we have a 201 created. So normally we use this created response code when some resource has been created at the server side. So in case of post, we use this because post normally creates resource, and also we use this with put request whenever put request creates a new resource. So that time we need to notify client that new resource has been created successfully by your request. Next we have 204 no content, and this response code represents that request has been successful but there is no content in response body, but header will be there, so client can get additional information from header only. So sometimes we encounter some situation where after success response we have nothing to show, or sometimes server need to show very few details and header can be used for that. In that case we use this response code, and 204 indicates that there is nothing in the response body. So next we have is the 205 reset content, and this response code server sends when after successful request we need to reset the document or we need to reset the resource. So normally we see this while filling some form, and in that form after submitting that form got reset or UI get refreshed. So we use this 205 reset content for that purpose. And the next we have is 206 partial content. So this response code represents that data in response body is partial, it is not entire document. So for example, if a document is huge or data is huge in size, especially multi-part file where we divide entire file in multiple chunks. So we need to use range header property for that, where client needs to specify range in bytes in that property, and which represent the chunk that client needs. And server will respond with that particular chunk of entire document, and that means is server is sending partial content, it is not the entire document. So in that case we receive this 206 response code. So this was success related response code, and next we have redirection related response code. So sometimes we have to redirect requests to some other location, or we have to restructure our system. In that case we have to use this response code. So here first we have is 300 multiple choice. So this response code represents that there are multiple resource options found for this client's request. So for example, we found multiple versions of the same document, or we have different kind of format of the same document. In that case server responds with this one, and in the response server will generate location header where we can find a different link to specific resource. So after this response code, client needs to select one of the location header URL to get the final version of that resource. So moving ahead, we have 301 moved permanently and 308 permanent redirect. So here 301 and 308 represents that a resource has been moved to some other location permanently. And normally we have to use this kind of resource code when we update something or we restructure our system where that resource is not found at that place. So location property in header have location URL pointing to the actual location or the new location of the resource, and the client needs to call second time with this new URL. And this both response code represent that, but here only difference between 301 and 308 is in case of 301, while second time request to new URL, client not allowed to change HTTP method. It needs to use the same HTTP method used while first call. So for example, first time we call with the GET API and we got 301 with a new location, that calling at the second time we have to use the GET method only, we can't change the method. But in case of 308, client can use a different HTTP method if it requires. So there is no restriction for using the same HTTP method. And all other features of 301 and 308 is same. So same way we have two response code for temporary redirect, which is 302 found and 307 temporary redirect. So we use this temporary redirect response code in case of temporary movement or temporary redirection of some resource in case of some maintenance work or some other reasons. Here both 302 and 307 represents that resource has been moved temporarily and actual location or current location is in the location property of the header. And here same way, the only difference here is that In case of 302, while calling the second request or while calling the second new URL, client not allowed to change the HTTP method. It needs to use the same HTTP method used while first call. But in case of 307, temporary redirect, client allowed to change HTTP method. So moving ahead, we have 304 not modified, and we already seen this response. And this code is very important because when client requests data with if match or if none match or with some conditional header property, where server validates whether resource has been modified since last time or not. So if not modified, then it will return 304 header with empty body because client already have latest data with it. And if modified, then it will return 200 OK with request body or current updated data. So let me go to Postman, and here first time if I fire get API, I get resource as well as in header I will get e-tag value, and the client needs to store this value in its local cache or somewhere. And next time when we fire same request for latest data, in that request we need to put this value in if match or if none match property. And when we fire this API, server will validate that if that response hasn't been modified since last retrieval, then server won't send any request body again. It will send only 304 not modified response code with header, and it won't send any request body. So this approach is very helpful in saving our network bandwidth, because here by not sending this request body, we are saving the network bandwidth. So moving ahead, we have a 400 series of error code, which is for client error responses. That means that something is wrong with the request coming from client. And first we have 400 bad requests. So that means server could not understand the request because of invalid syntax or something is not right with the request body. And here this error could be anything, such as some validation error or some format error. So for example, client fired some update employee details API, and in that request employee ID is wrong and system can't find that employee ID. In that case, server can throw 400 bad requests. Or we have some email which is a wrong email, then we need to validate that email. So in that case also we can fire this 400 bad requests. So here in my local, I started my example Spring Boot project, and I am firing API with wrong request body, and because of that server is rejecting the request. But if I pass valid data, then it will let me execute it. So moving ahead, we have 401 unauthorized error code. So the meaning of this response code is that the client must authenticate itself by providing valid authorization. And for that they need to provide valid credential before executing the request. And we know that there are many different types of authentication approaches we can use, such as basic auth or OAuth, and we already discussed about them in previous tutorial. So here I have one simple Spring Boot application with basic security enabled, and let me start this application. So after this, go to Postman, and here is I fire API without credentials, then it will give me this unauthorized response error. But if I go to authorization, select basic and provide valid user credentials, then server will let me fetch the information. So this way we can implement basic security related stuff, and without that authentication, server won't allow to process any further. So moving ahead, we know that security is one of the fundamental requirement of any system, and we have one more code for that, which is 403 forbidden response code. So which means that server knows the client, and even if authentication is correct, even if all the details are correct, server is rejecting the request because of accessing the resource. So we get this 403 forbidden response because client is valid, client and server also recognize the client, but that particular client don't have permission to access particular resource. And in this case, even if we retry, it won't make any difference because client is not allowed at all to access that information. So next we have a 404 not found response code, and the meaning of this status code is server couldn't find resource requested by client. So there is multiple meaning of it, URL not recognized or URL is correct but resource doesn't exist. So this code we'll see very often on web because of widely use of it, and sometimes server respond with this code to hide some sensitive information also for security reasons. And next we have 405 method not allowed. So this response code indicates that HTTP method for request is recognized by server but it is not allowed on the resource. So here on this URL, I am firing delete method, and this delete method is not allowed for this particular resource. So server will respond with 405 method not allowed. And here, if I go to header, then I can see something called allow header property. And this property gives suggestion about what is correct method allowed for this resource. So here I can see get method, and if I fire get here, then it will work. So ideally for any resource, head and get method shouldn't respond with this code, because head and get method should always be allowed on every resource. So moving ahead, we have 406 not acceptable error code. So if you remember at the time of header discussion, where we have seen this accept header property, and we know that by putting required content type in this accept property, client can do content negotiation. So at the time of returning back, server will do some conversation using this algorithm called content negotiation algorithm. But what happens is sometimes this kind of algorithm doesn't support the format that client require. In that case, server will throw this error. The meaning of the resource code is client required resource format is not acceptable by this server. So here in my local, I have one test program which is running, and if I put this accept property with application XML and fire the API, it is returning 406 error code, because server can't convert the resource in XML format. Moving ahead, we have 409 conflict, and we already discussed this in our previous tutorial, where we have seen that if multiple clients try to update or try to change same request, same resource at a time, then we can get this response. So next we have 418 I am a teapot error code. So this response code came as a April Fool joke in 1998. So we're not going to use it, but it was fun to know that it can happen in our computing world. So moving ahead, we have last but not least server related error codes which start with 500. So in here, first error code we have is 500 internal server error, and this response code indicate that server encountered something, or something which is server related to, or server's problem which is not allowing to fulfill this request, such as some kind of exception or some kind of unfamiliar situation happen at the system side. So here in my local some test program running, and here intentionally I am throwing some exception, and if I fire this API, it is causing this 500 internal server error. So additionally, it is also a generic response. That means is anything goes wrong at the server side, and if server can't find any appropriate response code for the situation, then server can always respond with this 500 response code. And also server can put additional detail in header if required. So moving ahead, we have 503 service unavailable response. As name suggests, a server respond with this error code when the server is not ready to accept request. So the reason of this not accepting the request could be anything like overload at the server side, or server is down, something like that. So as a developer, we can't control this error code, but it is better to know about this, because if we know about this, then we know what is happening at that server side. Moving ahead, we have 504 gateway timeouts, and this error code indicates that server which is acting as a gateway or proxy or some intermediary did not get response from other main server in time. So we know that we can have multiple proxies, or in other words, different layers in between client and server. So sometimes if one of them server doesn't respond in time, then we get this error code. So this is kind of a safety mechanism, because if something major is wrong at the server side, like too much load, in that case client need to wait for a long time. Also, that request can create additional load on server and further slowing it down. So with this 504 gateway timeout code, proxy is telling client that proxy rejected that request because of some issue at the server side, so try again after some time. So this was very basic idea about error code and how to use them, but I didn't cover everything here, but you can always go online and you can learn about them. So I've already put the link into the description. So that's all for now in this tutorial, and don't forget to check out description for downloadable link of a summary of this tutorial, and also tell me how you like this tutorial, and give me your suggestions and questions in comment box, and I will try my best to give answers. Also, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and see you guys in next tutorial. Till then, keep learning. Thank you very much.